What if the story of God that has been handed down to you was never the whole story? What if behind the sermons, beneath the scriptures, there lies a truth so powerful it had to be erased? A truth that the first gods humanity worshipped were black, and that they did not simply rule the skies or the seas, but life and death itself? Imagine a world thousands of years before the name Yahweh was ever spoken, when the Nile's floods dictated survival and kings were buried in tombs meant to carry them into eternity. In this world, the divine was not a distant idea. It was embodied in the gods and goddesses who walked alongside the people, fierce, compassionate, terrifying, nurturing. These gods bore black features because they were born of black lands. They controlled the cycles of nature, the rise of the sun, the flow of rivers, the harvest of crops. But more than this, they presided over the greatest mystery of all, death and what lies beyond it. Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the underworld, was more than a figure of myth. He embodied the eternal promise that death was not an end but a passage. With him stood Isis, the healer and mother, whose love resurrected her husband and offered humanity a glimpse of renewal. Together they formed a vision of eternity that shaped the consciousness of civilizations for millennia. To the people of Nubia, Kush, and Egypt, these gods were not distant idols but guardians of life itself. Yet, if their presence was once so central, why do most people know nothing of them today? Why do sermons warn against false gods without ever naming who they were? The answer is not ignorance, it is deliberate erasure. Because a people who know their gods cannot be controlled. A people who remember that their ancestors walked with divinity cannot be enslaved in spirit. To erase the gods who controlled life and death was to erase a people's claim to their own power. And so, over centuries, their temples were desecrated, their names recast as demons, their stories rewritten into the scriptures of others. What was once a proud inheritance became a forbidden memory. Even now, traces remain in broken statues, faded wall carvings, and myths hidden beneath biblical narratives. Osiris rising from death echoes in stories of resurrection. Ma'at's balance of truth lingers in visions of judgment. Isis's nurturing love resurfaces in the image of Mary. These are not coincidences. They are fragments of a story the world was never meant to remember. But memory cannot be killed. It lingers in the soil, in the bloodline, in the collective soul. And when you follow those fragments, when you dare to piece them together, a forbidden truth emerges. Before Yahweh, before empire, before erasure, the black gods controlled the most sacred of mysteries, the cycle of life and death. If their memory still vibrates through the stories we tell today, then perhaps they were never fully silenced at all. Perhaps their voices are still here, waiting for us to listen. If memory refuses to die, then we must ask, who were these gods that carried such power over the very cycle of existence? Their names, etched in stone and whispered through millennia, still resonate even when distorted by time and empire. These were not small deities presiding over trivial domains. They were the custodians of life itself, the gatekeepers of death, the architects of eternity. Among them, Osiris stands foremost. He was more than a myth, he was the embodiment of renewal. His story begins with betrayal and death, torn apart by his brother Set. Yet it does not end there. Through the devotion of Isis, his body is restored, his spirit awakened, and he rises to become Lord of the underworld. To his people, Osiris offered a radical promise. Death was not a final curtain but a doorway. Every human soul would stand before him, weighed for truth, judged for justice, and guided into what lay beyond. This vision of life after death was not an Egyptian invention alone, it rippled outward, shaping how entire civilizations imagined eternity. Beside him stood Isis, the divine mother, whose magic and love conquered even death itself. She was more than consort to Osiris. She was healer, protector, and creator. In her arms, Horus, the falcon-headed child of resurrection, rose as the symbol of divine kingship. To worship Isis was to know that the sacred feminine was not secondary but essential, that without the mother there is no rebirth, no continuation of life's cycle. Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian, carried another piece of the mystery. He prepared the dead for their journey, presiding over embalming, protecting tombs, guiding souls through darkness. His black skin was not a symbol of evil but of fertility, of the rich soil of the Nile, of the promise that death returns us to life. When a body was placed in his care, it was not simply being preserved, it was being consecrated for eternity. And then there was Ma'at, the principle embodied as a goddess: truth, justice, balance. Every soul, no matter how powerful, would be weighed against her feather. A light heart passed into bliss. A heavy heart was devoured, erased. In Ma'at's presence, even kings were humbled, for no one could escape the balance of the cosmos. Together, these deities formed a complete vision of life and death. They offered not fear but order, not despair but continuity. They taught that existence was a cycle, that death fed life, that justice transcended flesh. They were not distant rulers demanding blind obedience. They were mirrors of humanity's deepest questions. What happens when I die? How do I live rightly? Where does my spirit go? And it is here that we find the heart of the erasure. Because when the church replaced these gods with a single jealous deity, it did not only alter ritual, it shattered this holistic vision of eternity. The cycle became linear. The afterlife became binary, heaven or hell. The goddess was silenced, the guardian demonized, the principle of balance reduced to punishment. What was once a rich tapestry of divine wisdom was flattened into fear, but fragments of the old vision still remain, hidden in plain sight. The resurrection story, the final judgment, the divine mother, all echoes of the gods who once ruled life and death. And if those echoes persist, then perhaps their power never truly left. Perhaps we are still walking in the shadows of the gods whose thrones were stolen but never destroyed. If Osiris, Isis, Anubis, and Ma'at once ruled the mysteries of life and death, why do their names no longer echo in sermons? Why do we instead hear of resurrection, judgment, and eternal life in the language of Yahweh and Christ? The truth is that these older gods were not erased by absence. They were rewritten. Their power was absorbed, their stories retold, their faces replaced. The Bible itself carries shadows of their legacy, even as it condemns them as idols. Take resurrection. Christianity presents it as the heart of the gospel, a savior who dies and rises again, defeating death. Yet Osiris was resurrected long before the cross stood in Jerusalem. His death and rebirth were the centerpiece of Egyptian belief, carved into tombs and temples, recited in rituals that promised eternal life. To see Christ's resurrection without Osiris is to read a page torn from a much older book. Consider judgment. In Revelation, souls are weighed, the faithful rewarded, the wicked condemned. But Ma'at had already presided over the weighing of souls, feather in hand, long before Revelation was written. Every Egyptian knew that to live out of balance was to doom the heart. The biblical image of judgment is not new. It is a mirror of a goddess erased but never forgotten. Or take the word itself. In Genesis, Yahweh creates by speaking. In John, Christ is called the Logos, the Word made flesh. Yet Ptah, another black creator god, spoke the world into existence thousands of years earlier. His tongue, not his hands, formed reality. The Christian narrative of divine speech is a direct echo of Ptah's ancient power, stripped of his name but not his essence. Even the figure of Mary carries whispers of Isis. The image of mother and child, a woman holding her infant son, revered as sacred, is nearly identical to the statues of Isis cradling Horus. The parallel is so striking that early Christian converts often could not distinguish the two. The church allowed the image but severed the name, ensuring devotion continued while its origins were obscured. This pattern repeats again and again. The storm-bringer Yahweh mirrors Baal. The jealous god reflects the conquest-driven deities of Canaan. The angel of death walks in the shadow of Anubis. The more we look, the clearer the inheritance becomes. The Bible is not free of these gods. It is haunted by them. But why absorb instead of simply ignore? Because erasure is never complete without replacement. If people had been told simply to abandon their gods, memory would have endured. Instead, the church rewrote the myths, making them familiar yet foreign, stripping them of their black faces and placing them in new narratives. This was not only theology, it was strategy. People accepted the new stories because they already recognized their bones, yet the bones tell their own tale. Beneath the layers of scripture, the fingerprints of the black gods remain. You can hear Osiris in resurrection, Ma'at in judgment, Isis in the mother of Christ. The gods were hidden, but their power seeped through the cracks, echoing in words meant to erase them. And if the Bible itself carries their shadows, then erasure was never as complete as the church intended. For even in the texts meant to silence them, the black gods still speak. If the echoes of black gods still pulse beneath scripture, then we must ask, how did Yahweh rise to eclipse them all? How did one name become supreme in a world once filled with thrones of divinity? The answer lies not in peace but in conquest, not in originality but in appropriation. Yahweh's ascent was marked by jealousy, a constant demand for exclusivity, a relentless war against the very gods whose wisdom he inherited. The earliest biblical texts reveal this tension. Again and again, Yahweh commands his people to tear down the high places, to burn the groves, to destroy the altars of Baal, Asherah, and Molech. These were not imaginary rivals. They were living traditions, deeply rooted in African and Afro-Asiatic lands. Their shrines were filled with worshippers, their rituals woven into the fabric of life. The repeated insistence on their destruction proves how powerful they were. A God without rivals does not rage against competition. A God who is truly unique does not need to demand loyalty. Yahweh's fury betrays his vulnerability. This jealousy set the tone for his transformation. At first, Yahweh was a storm god of a small people, his voice in thunder, his power in lightning. Like Baal, he brought rain. Like Set, he wielded chaos in war. But over time, his followers reshaped him into more than a stormbringer. They stitched onto him the powers of the gods. They displaced the creation of Ptah, the resurrection of Osiris, the judgment of Ma'at. In absorbing these attributes, Yahweh grew in stature, but at the cost of erasing their names. What was once a pantheon became a monopoly. Why was this necessary? Because theology was also politics. To consolidate Israel's identity as a chosen people, Yahweh had to be supreme. Every rival god was a threat to national unity. Every shrine outside his temple was a reminder that Israel was not the only nation with divine favor. And so Yahweh's jealousy became not only spiritual but political. To worship another god was not merely a sin, it was treason. This transformation explains why Yahweh appears at once powerful and insecure. He is omnipotent, yet enraged by statues of wood and stone. He is eternal, yet threatened by forgotten names. He is love, yet promises curses to the children of those who disobey. Such contradictions make sense only when you see him for what he was. A god in competition, a deity fighting to survive against older, deeper, blacker powers. And this is why the erasure had to be absolute. It was not enough to forbid worship. The old gods had to be demonized. Their names had to vanish. Their myths had to be rewritten. Yahweh could not simply rise. He had to rise over their broken thrones. But memory has a way of surviving jealousy. The more Yahweh absorbed, the more he revealed his sources. The more he erased, the more the absence cried out. His wrath did not silence the black gods. It testified to their presence. If jealousy fueled Yahweh's rise, then conquest sealed it. For what begins as anger becomes empire, and it is through empire that gods are enthroned or erased. Jealousy may have fueled Yahweh's rise, But jealousy alone does not conquer nations. What gave him power was conquest, the merging of God and empire, the use of theology as a weapon of rule. For in the ancient world, religion was never only about heaven. It was also about land, law, and loyalty. To elevate Yahweh meant not only to silence rivals, but to build a political identity around his name. And once that fusion began, erasure of the black gods became inevitable. In Israel's earliest days, Yahweh was a tribal god. His promises were tied to territory. I will give you this land. I will drive out your enemies. He was not yet the eternal Lord of the cosmos, but a war, God of a people struggling for survival. Battles were framed not only as struggles for land, but as contests of divinity. If Israel won, Yahweh was supreme. If Israel lost, it was their fault, not his weakness, but their disobedience. This logic was brilliant in its simplicity. Yahweh's power could never be questioned, no matter the outcome. But over centuries, this tribal deity was remade into a national emblem. To worship Yahweh became synonymous with loyalty to Israel. To abandon him was treason, betrayal not only of God, but of nation. Religious exclusivity became political necessity. And so the gods of neighboring lands, Baal, Asherah, Osiris, Ma'at, were more than spiritual competitors. They were political threats. To bow to them was to weaken the identity of Israel itself. The pattern did not end there. Centuries later, Christianity inherited Yahweh and reshaped him once again. No longer just the God of a small people, he became the God of empire. Rome, the very empire that crucified Christ, eventually adopted his name as its official banner. What had been the faith of the persecuted became the faith of emperors. Under Constantine and his successors, Yahweh's cross marched with soldiers, painted on shields, invoked in wars of conquest. The jealous tribal god was enthroned as cosmic ruler through the machinery of empire. And with empire comes erasure. The black gods, once guardians of life and death, became enemies of civilization. Their temples were torn down, their rituals outlawed, their images recast as demons. In Africa, missionaries followed in the footsteps of conquerors, branding orishas, vodun, and ancestral spirits as witchcraft. To resist Yahweh was not only heresy, it was rebellion against empire itself. This fusion of God and power created a self-reinforcing system. Yahweh legitimized conquest, and conquest legitimized Yahweh. The cycle of erasure was sealed. And yet, within the ruins of temples, within the whispered prayers of enslaved peoples, the memory of the black gods endured. Their thrones may have been toppled by empire, but their essence could not be fully destroyed. This is the paradox of empire. It seeks to erase, but in erasing, it leaves scars, traces of what it tried to bury, and those scars still speak. For every altar torn down, a story remained. For every goddess condemned, a symbol endured. And for every god recast as a demon, a whisper of divinity survived in the hearts of the people. If empire enthroned Yahweh, then it also taught us to fear what it sought to erase. And this fear would become the next great weapon of control. Empires conquer with swords, but they rule with fear. Once Yahweh was enthroned as the God of empire, physical conquest was no longer enough. The body could be enslaved, but the soul had to be captured too. And so the memory of the black gods, gods who offered renewal, balance, and kinship, was replaced with doctrines of guilt, sin, and eternal punishment. What was once a spirituality of empowerment became a system of control. In African traditions, the sacred was woven into daily life. Osiris promised renewal beyond death. Ma'at measured the heart against truth, not dogma. Isis healed with love and power, her magic rooted in care. Even Anubis, guardian of the dead, was a guide, not a tormentor. These deities did not demand blind obedience. They demanded balance, justice, harmony with nature and self. Spirituality was liberation, not chains. Yahweh, however, was reshaped into something different. He became a jealous God who punished entire nations for disobedience. His love was conditional, his blessings tied to submission, his wrath swift and absolute. No longer was the afterlife a cycle of renewal. It became a courtroom with only two verdicts: eternal bliss or eternal fire. Life was reduced to a test, and every human soul walked beneath the weight of condemnation. Fear was the new altar. Fear of hell, fear of wrath, fear of sin so pervasive that even natural instincts, desire, joy, sexuality, ancestral memory were recast as corruption. Under this system, the body was no longer sacred, it was shameful. The earth was no longer a reflection of the divine, it was fallen. Ancestral practices were no longer wisdom, they were demonic. With every act of demonization, the people moved further from their gods and deeper into chains of fear. This psychological conquest was far more effective than the sword. A soldier can be resisted, but when you fear your own thoughts, your own ancestors, your own body, you police yourself. You become your own oppressor. Guilt becomes a cage that needs no guard. Yet even here, memory fought back. The rhythms of African drums still beat in secret, echoing the promise that joy was sacred. The rituals of the Orishas persisted under the names of saints. The feather of Ma'at lingered in the subconscious, reminding the people that justice, not fear, was the true measure of the soul. The church sought to replace freedom with obedience, but fragments of truth refused to die. And it is in these fragments that we begin to see the deepest wound of all, the silencing of the feminine, the deliberate erasure of goddesses who once balanced heaven with their presence. To truly understand what was lost, we must look not only at the gods but at the goddesses, the queens of heaven, the mothers of creation, the keepers of wisdom whose names once anchored entire civilizations. For in the cosmologies of Africa and the ancient Near East, divinity was never only male. It was mother and father, womb and seed, balance and power. To erase these goddesses was to cut the heavens in half, leaving humanity with a distorted image of the sacred. Isis was perhaps the most beloved of them all. She was not only wife to Osiris, but the mother of Horus, the healer of the broken, the magician whose love could overcome death itself. Her statues, carved across Egypt and beyond, showed her nursing her child, an image so enduring that it later inspired depictions of Mary and Jesus. But where Isis wielded power, Mary was reduced to silence, stripped of her magic, transformed from goddess into passive figure. This was not a reflection of history, it was a deliberate diminishment of the divine feminine. Ma'at carried another face of the sacred. She was not merely a goddess, but a principle woven into the fabric of the universe. Her feather weighed the hearts of kings and commoners alike. She embodied truth, justice, and harmony, ensuring that even rulers could not escape the laws of balance. To erase her was to erase the idea that justice transcends earthly power. In her absence, obedience replaced harmony, law replaced balance, hierarchy replaced equality. Asherah, too, once stood beside Yahweh himself. Archaeological inscriptions speak of Yahweh and his Asherah, revealing that Israel's God was not originally imagined alone but in partnership. She was the mother goddess, the tree of life, the fertility of the land. Yet her name was stricken from scripture, her groves cut down, her presence condemned as sin. The masculine remained, the feminine was erased. And why? Because goddesses represented a kind of power empire could not control. They affirmed the sacredness of women's bodies, the holiness of creation, the authority of balance over domination. To honor Isis, Ma'at, or Asherah was to acknowledge that life itself flowed through the feminine. For a patriarchal church, for a system of conquest, this was intolerable. The feminine had to be silenced, reduced, demonized, or hidden beneath new names. But silence is not absence. Even now, the echoes of the goddesses remain. In every image of a mother cradling her child, Isis whispers. In every demand for justice and truth, Ma'at's feather is felt. In every tree that nourishes, Asherah's presence stirs. Though erased from official memory, they linger in the collective soul, waiting to be remembered. And if the feminine could be silenced, so too could the entire spiritual systems of Africa. For the next weapon of erasure would not be rewriting or diminishment, it would be demonization. When rewriting and silencing were not enough, a more ruthless tactic emerged: demonization. The black gods who once guided birth, guarded death, and balanced the cosmos were no longer simply ignored. They were recast as enemies of the new faith. Their names became curses. Their rituals were branded sorcery. Their worship was painted not as devotion but as rebellion against the true God. What was once sacred was deliberately transformed into sin. The Old Testament hints at this strategy. Baal, Asherah, Molech, all condemned as abominations, their worship outlawed, their followers massacred. Yet these texts rarely explain who these gods truly were. The silence is strategic. To describe them too clearly would invite memory, and memory is dangerous. Better to let them remain shadows, defined only by condemnation. As Christianity spread across Africa and the world, this pattern intensified. The Orishas of Yoruba lands, Shango, the thunderer, Oshun, the goddess of rivers, Yemaya, the mother of the seas, were renamed as demons. Vodun spirits of Dahomey, Inkisi powers of Central Africa, Kemetic deities of the Nile, all branded as evil. Missionaries tore down shrines, burned masks, and called drumming the sound of the devil. What they could not erase, they demonized. But demonization was never about truth. It was about control. A people who believe their own gods are devils will abandon them willingly. A child taught that their grandmother's rituals are witchcraft will grow ashamed of their heritage. A nation convinced that its own ancestors were cursed will kneel before foreign altars. To brand the black gods as demons was to colonize not just the land but the soul. And yet, the strategy backfired in subtle ways. Because even in demonization, the gods remained present. Their names were still spoken in fear, yes, but spoken nonetheless. Their rhythms still pulsed beneath Christian hymns, hidden in plain sight. Their symbols resurfaced in disguised forms. Shango beneath Saint Barbara, Oshun beneath the Virgin of Charity, Isis beneath Mary. The gods adapted, cloaking themselves in the very faith meant to destroy them. Demonization also revealed something the church never intended to admit. These gods mattered. They were too powerful to ignore, too deeply rooted to erase. If they were truly nothing, why spend centuries condemning them? Why burn their images, ban their rituals, and rewrite their names into monsters? The ferocity of the attack proves the depth of their influence. For those who look closely, the irony is clear. The so-called demons offered life, balance, fertility, and justice, while the jealous new god demanded fear, submission, and conquest. What was demonized was not evil but empowerment, and what was exalted was not balance but control. Still, even through fear, the gods survived. They lived in whispers, in hidden ceremonies, in the beat of drums muffled by law but never silenced. And in these whispers we find the next truth, that memory, though scarred, endured, carried by oral traditions, disguised in rituals, waiting for a time when it could rise again. No empire, no church decree, no missionary's hand could fully erase the memory of the black gods. Temples could be torn down, sacred groves burned, drums silenced under threat of death, but memory does not live in stone alone. It lives in stories, in songs, in the breath of elders. And while the official histories claimed the gods were dead, their names and powers survived in the whispers of those who refused to forget. In villages across Africa, oral tradition became the ark of survival. A grandmother telling her grandchildren tales of wise ancestors slipped in the names of Oshun or Shango, A father teaching his son the cycles of the Nile recited the myth of Osiris and Isis as if it were family history. Storytellers disguised deities as characters, passing on divine truths under the cloak of folklore. Knowledge hid in riddles, proverbs, and fables. Erasure failed because memory found new disguises. Across the Atlantic, enslaved Africans carried these whispers into captivity. In Brazil, candomblé emerged, where Yoruba gods were hidden behind Catholic saints, their colors and symbols preserved. In Cuba, Santeria followed the same path, a fusion that was not surrender but survival. In Haiti, Vodun stood tall, its spirits invoked in ceremonies that masked themselves with Christian prayers while keeping the old powers alive. In the American South, the sorrow songs of the enslaved carried coded meanings, not only about escape but about spiritual freedom, about a God who still walked with them, not the God of the slave master, but the gods of their ancestors. Even in silence, the rhythm continued. When drumming was banned, hands clapped in secret. When rituals were outlawed, they were hidden in festivals. When names were forbidden, they were whispered into food, into lullabies, into dreams. The gods endured because the people endured, carrying them in their bodies, in their blood, in their bones. This survival reveals something profound. The gods were never as absent as the church wanted us to believe. They lived in the shadows of every hymn sung off beat, every dance that slipped into old patterns, every feast that carried flavors tied to ancestral offerings. They lived in the instinct to resist, to celebrate, to honor the dead. Even when unnamed, they remained present. And today, those whispers are rising again. Scholars uncover ancient inscriptions proving Yahweh once shared his throne with Asherah. Archaeologists unearth symbols of Ma'at and Osiris in places the Bible condemns as pagan. Communities across the diaspora openly reclaim Orisha worship, Kemetic spirituality, and ancestral rituals. What was once whispered in secret is now spoken aloud with pride. But memory is not only about survival, it is about power. For when a people remember their gods, they remember themselves. They remember that divinity was never foreign, that before Yahweh demanded fear, their ancestors already knew gods who offered balance, love, justice, and renewal. And this memory does more than heal wounds of the past, it challenges the structures of the present, which is why the return of the black gods is not just a cultural revival, it is a revolution. The whispers that carried memory through centuries of silence are no longer whispers. They are voices. They are drums beating openly again. Across the world, the gods once condemned as demons, once hidden behind saints, once whispered only in secret, are returning. Their names are being spoken, their altars rebuilt, their power reclaimed. And with their return comes a challenge not only to religion but to the very foundations of power itself. In Brazil, candomblé houses of worship flourish, honoring the Orishas with song, dance, and offerings. In Cuba, Santeria thrives, where Shango's thunder and Oshun's sweetness are celebrated in full color. In Haiti, Vodun is not a relic but a living force, guiding communities, healing bodies and spirits, and standing as a symbol of survival. Across West Africa, Yoruba, Akan, and Kemetic traditions are practiced openly again, no longer hidden under colonial shame but embraced as heritage. Even in the West, far from their ancestral roots, the gods are returning. In the United States, young people of the diaspora are studying Orishas, pouring libations to ancestors, learning the cosmologies that were once stolen from them. In Europe, practitioners of Kemetic spirituality reconstruct the rituals of ancient Egypt, calling again on Osiris, Isis, Ma'at, and Anubis. Social media carries their names farther than empire ever imagined, spreading the memory of gods that centuries of erasure could not destroy. This revival is more than spiritual curiosity. It is a healing of wounds. For generations, Black people were told their heritage was demonic, their ancestors cursed, their gods evil. To reclaim these gods is to reclaim dignity, identity, and truth. It is to declare that the divine was never confined to European images or biblical narratives, but walked in Africa long before Yahweh was named. It is to stand against the lie that salvation required abandoning ancestry, and this is why their return is feared. For if Osiris already taught resurrection, then Jesus is not unique. If Ma'at already weighed hearts, then revelation is not unprecedented. If Isis already embodied divine motherhood, then Mary is not alone. If Shango, Oshun, and Yemaya still command thunder, rivers, and seas, then Yahweh is not the sole master of creation. The church loses its monopoly when the gods return, but the return is not about replacing Yahweh. It is about balance. It is about restoring what empire cut away, healing the torn fabric of spiritual identity, remembering what was silenced. For when the black gods rise, they do not come only as figures of the past. They come as living forces, reminding us that life, death, justice, joy, and renewal have always been sacred. And so we arrive at a crossroads. The gods are rising. The people are remembering. The structures built on forgetting are trembling. And as this awakening spreads, it is no longer just about spirituality. It is about culture, identity, and liberation. Because when the forgotten gods stand again, the world itself begins to change. The return of the black gods is not confined to temples or rituals. It is reshaping culture, politics, and identity across the globe. For centuries, the dominant narrative told humanity that divinity flowed in only one direction, from Jerusalem, from Rome, from Europe. But as the gods of Africa rise again, that story fractures. And when the story breaks, the world begins to change. In Africa, the revival is cultural as much as spiritual. Young generations are rediscovering Yoruba cosmology, Akan proverbs, and Kemetic wisdom. They are reclaiming traditions demonized under colonial rule and declaring them sources of strength. The gods become more than religious figures. They become symbols of resistance, of pride, of continuity with ancestors who endured erasure but never forgot who they were. Across the diaspora, the impact runs even deeper. For centuries, descendants of enslaved Africans were taught to see their heritage as cursed. Their rituals were branded witchcraft, their ancestors condemned as pagans. To call again on Shango, Oshun, Ma'at, or Osiris is to break chains that reached across oceans. It is to declare, our ancestors were not savages, they were guardians of divine wisdom. Their gods are not demons, they are the keepers of life and death. And this remembrance unsettles power. It exposes the myth that Europe was the center of civilization. It challenges the lie that Christianity brought light to a dark continent. It undermines the idea that salvation requires rejecting your roots. When people see divinity in their own image, when they embrace gods that empire tried to bury, they no longer bow as easily to systems built on erasure. Even in the West, cracks are forming. Scholars increasingly admit the parallels between biblical narratives and African myths. Artists depict the divine with African features, reimagining icons once frozen in European likeness. Movements for racial justice weave ancestral spirituality into their vision of liberation. As the gods return, so too does the knowledge that the sacred was never the monopoly of one faith, one people, one empire. This global awakening reveals something profound. Spirituality is not static. It shifts, evolves, resurfaces. The gods do not die. They wait. And when they return, they bring with them not only rituals but worldviews. A worldview where justice is balance, not punishment. Where death is transition, not terror. Where the feminine is honored as sacred, not silenced. Where humanity is part of creation, not master over it. The more people remember, the more the old structures tremble. The church fears this because it knows its monopoly is fragile. Empires fear this because they built power on forgetting. But remembrance is spreading faster than censorship can contain. And as it spreads, it transforms not just individuals but societies. For when the world remembers, it does not return to the past. It steps into a future where divinity is vast, where the forgotten gods rise, and where humanity reclaims what was stolen. And once the gods of life and death are remembered, the next question emerges. How will their presence reshape the way we see ourselves, our bodies, and our very souls? The return of the black gods is not only a matter of history, it is a matter of the soul. For centuries, colonization and the church taught people of African descent to fear their own heritage, to see their ancestors as cursed, their rituals as wicked, their gods as demons. This was more than a spiritual conquest. It was a wound, a deep psychological cut that severed communities from their own power. To reclaim the gods who controlled life and death is to begin healing that wound. Fear was the first poison. Generations were told that drumming summoned devils, that libations to ancestors were necromancy, that dances honoring the earth were sinful. Children grew up ashamed of their grandparents' traditions, believing salvation required abandoning blood and bone. Spirituality became a burden of guilt, not a source of freedom. Even the body itself was recast as dangerous pleasure, suspect, desire condemned. Blackness treated as a mark of sin rather than the reflection of the divine. But the gods offer another way. In the cosmologies of Osiris and Ma'at, life is not a fall from grace, but a cycle of renewal. Death is not damnation, but passage. The body is not an enemy, but a temple. Isis heals, Anubis guides, Ma'at balances, Osiris restores. These gods teach that divinity is not foreign, not hostile, not distant. It is intimate, woven into the very fabric of existence. To remember them is to remember that fear is not the root of the sacred. Connection is. Healing begins when the lie is exposed, when people see that their ancestors were not worshiping demons but celebrating life, when they realize that the rituals branded as witchcraft were prayers of balance, when they understand that their heritage was demonized not because it was evil but because it was powerful. Then the wound begins to close. Guilt is replaced by pride. Shame is replaced by dignity. Silence is replaced by song. This healing is not only individual, but collective. Communities rediscover their rhythms, their dances, their feasts. They celebrate gods who look like them, who honor their bodies, who teach them that justice is truth, not fear. The return of the gods becomes the return of identity itself. No longer must a child grow up thinking divinity wears only foreign faces. No longer must entire peoples bow to a god who demanded they forget their ancestors. And healing is contagious. One voice remembering inspires another. One drumbeat awakens a community. One ritual sparks a revival. The gods do not return through thunder alone. They return through the quiet courage of people refusing to be ashamed of who they are. Yet healing also reveals the depth of what was lost. For once the wound begins to close, another question rises. If our ancestors carried such powerful gods, what else did they carry that was stolen or silenced? What wisdom lies buried not only in temples but in the rhythms of daily life? When the conquerors erased the black gods, they struck hardest at the goddesses. For to silence the feminine in heaven was to weaken the feminine on earth. The mothers of creation, Isis, Ma'at, Hathor, Asherah, were more than figures of worship. They were mirrors of women's power, guardians of balance, keepers of everyday sacred wisdom. To erase them was to sever communities from the very rhythms of life. Isis was the healer who resurrected Osiris, the protector who shielded her child Horus, the embodiment of magic born of love. She was not passive but powerful, her motherhood not silence but strength. Ma'at carried the laws of truth and balance, a goddess who humbled kings and weighed every soul equally. Hathor embodied joy, fertility, and music, teaching that laughter and beauty were as sacred as law. Asherah, the forgotten consort of Yahweh, was the tree of life itself, symbol of fertility and the womb of creation. Together, they painted a vision of divinity where the feminine was not an accessory but a force equal to the masculine, and this balance was reflected in daily life. Ancient African spirituality did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. Preparing food, tending crops, giving birth, telling stories, all were infused with divine meaning. Women carried rituals in their hands and their voices, passing down prayers disguised as lullabies, wisdom woven into proverbs, blessings hidden in recipes. The divine lived in every gesture, every rhythm, every cycle of nature. The church feared this power because it was uncontrollable. A spirituality that lived in women's bodies and daily practices could not be confined to temples or priesthoods. It flowed too freely. It empowered too deeply. And so the goddesses were demonized, the rituals forbidden, the wisdom silenced. Women were cast as temptresses instead of guardians, their bodies labeled sinful instead of sacred, their voices dismissed instead of honored. But erasure was never total. Even as goddesses were silenced, fragments of their wisdom endured. The Virgin Mary inherited Isis's image, though stripped of power. Proverbs still echo Ma'at's call for justice. Songs still carry Hathor's joy. Trees planted in courtyards still whisper Asherah's memory. The sacred feminine hid itself in shadows, waiting for the moment it could rise again. Today, that rise has begun. Across the diaspora, women are reclaiming the names of Isis and Ma'at, pouring libations to Yemaya, dancing in Oshun's rivers, remembering that their bodies are temples, not prisons. The wisdom of the mothers is returning, bringing balance to a spirituality warped by conquest. And with this return comes a deeper truth. The gods and goddesses were never distant idols. They were woven into life itself, into birth and death, into work and rest, into the smallest gestures of survival. To remember them is to remember that every breath is sacred. But if every act was once divine, what did it mean when empire redefined the sacred as obedience alone? What happened when daily life, once a temple, was stripped of its holiness? Before erasure, daily life itself was holy. Planting seeds was a ritual of fertility. Drumming was communion with rhythm of the cosmos. Dance was prayer in motion. Love was sacred union, and death was passage into eternity, guided by gods who knew both compassion and justice. In African cosmologies, there was no hard line between the sacred and the ordinary, because life itself was divine. But empire could not control such a worldview. A people who find divinity in every breath, every drumbeat, every body, need no priest to mediate. They need no empire to validate. And so the conquerors redefined the sacred. They stripped it from the fields and hearths, from the womb and the drum, from the hands of women and the memory of ancestors, and they relocated it into temples, altars, and hierarchies. What was once free became licensed. What was once everywhere became centralized. To complete this shift, the church had to brand the old ways as sinful. The drum, once a heartbeat of prayer, was called a tool of devils. The dance, once celebration of creation, became lust and temptation. Libations poured for ancestors were condemned as necromancy. Healing herbs and incantations were recast as witchcraft. Even sexuality, once celebrated as fertility's gift, became shame, a burden to be hidden, a weakness to be confessed. The effect was devastating. People learned to distrust their own instincts, to despise their own bodies, to fear their own traditions. Joy became guilt. Rhythm became rebellion. Ancestral wisdom became a source of shame. Spirituality, once woven into every part of life, was reduced to obedience, a rigid line between holy and sinful, with power held firmly in the hands of priests. And yet, fragments of truth survived. The drum never fully went silent. its rhythm hid inside hymns and festival songs. The dance resurfaced in folk traditions, disguising its sacred roots. Herbs continued to heal in the hands of midwives and healers, passed on quietly through generations. Even sexuality resisted, its sacredness remembered in whispers, in rituals too private to be policed. But the wound was deep. Generations grew up believing that to honor their ancestors was to offend God, that to celebrate their bodies was to fall into sin, that to touch the earth was to risk corruption. What had once been freedom became chains of guilt. And yet, guilt carries its own cracks, because the more life was condemned, the more people hungered for a spirituality that could embrace it again. The more joy was suppressed, the more it pushed to return. The more the sacred was confined, the more it yearned to flow freely once more. And this yearning, this hunger for wholeness, is what fueled the survival of the gods in secret. For when the sacred is outlawed, it does not vanish. It goes underground, hiding until the time comes to rise again. When empire declared that the sacred belonged only to its temples and priests, the people did not simply surrender. They adapted, they hid, they disguised. And in doing so, they ensured that the gods of life and death, though outlawed, never disappeared. Beneath the watchful eyes of conquerors, secret altars were built. Festivals wore new names but carried old meanings. Rituals disguised themselves as harmless customs, yet within them, the power of the forgotten gods endured. In Africa, oral traditions became shields. Elders told stories of animals and heroes, but within the tales were veiled lessons about the gods. Proverbs carried the wisdom of Ma'at. Folklore disguised Isis's nurturing, Shango's thunder, Anansi's cunning. The conquerors dismissed these as children's tales, never realizing they were listening to a living scripture passed mouth to mouth, heart to heart. Across the Atlantic, enslaved Africans transformed survival into resistance. In Brazil, they hid orishas beneath the names of saints. Shango was cloaked in Saint Barbara, Oshun in Our Lady of Charity, Ogun in St. George. In Cuba, Santeria thrived under Catholic disguise. Each candle and rosary bead a mask for older, deeper prayers. In Haiti, Vodun carried the spirits through chains and whips, its rituals hidden under the veneer of Christian worship, its gods invoked in the very language of the oppressor. Even in North America, where surveillance was relentless, fragments survived. Spirituals sung in the fields carried coded messages not only of escape from slavery, but of spiritual deliverance, echoing the promises once made by Osiris and Isis. The rhythm of drums, banned by fearful masters, was reborn in clapping, foot-stomping, and call and response. The body itself became the altar, every sway and shout a defiance of silence. These hidden altars were more than survival tactics. They were acts of defiance. Each disguised ritual said, "Our gods live still." Each whispered prayer declared, "Our ancestors are not gone." Each dance, each drumbeat, each story carried the fire forward. The gods did not vanish into history. They lived in secret, in disguise, waiting for the day they could rise openly again. And rise they did. The Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history, was sparked in part by Vodun ceremonies. Drums called warriors to freedom. Spirits invoked courage against empire. Across the Americas, the survival of African gods under disguise gave enslaved people not only hope, but power. A reminder that their oppressor's God was not the only God, that their ancestors still walked beside them. This hidden survival reveals a deeper truth. Erasure is never complete. No matter how tightly empire polices, no matter how harshly it punishes, the sacred finds a way. For the gods of life and death were not only written in temples, they were written in blood, in rhythm, in memory itself. And what is carried in the body cannot be erased by decree. But survival in secret was only the beginning, for now the hidden altars are opening again. What was once underground is rising to the surface. And with this rise comes confrontation not just with religion, but with the very structures of power that built themselves on forgetting. The days of hidden altars are ending. What once lived in whispers and disguises now speaks aloud. Across Africa, across the diaspora, across the world, the black gods of life and death are rising from the shadows, no longer content to be saints in disguise or stories told in secret. Their names are called in ceremonies that no longer hide. Their symbols are worn with pride. Their voices, once muffled beneath empire's weight, are shaking the silence. In Brazil, processions for Oshun and Yemaya draw thousands to rivers and seas, their offerings carried on the water as a declaration that the goddesses of fertility and motherhood never left. In Cuba, Santeria practitioners now honor their orishas openly, no longer cloaked in Catholic imagery but revealed in full strength. In Haiti, Vodun continues not as a remnant of survival but as a thriving, unapologetic tradition, guiding communities in matters of justice, healing, and identity. In the West, where colonization worked hardest to bury memory, the unmasking is perhaps the most radical. Young people of African descent are returning to Orisha worship, Kemetic spirituality, and ancestral traditions, reclaiming what was stolen. Social media amplifies their voices, spreading images of Osiris, Ma'at, Isis, and Shango to millions. Scholars, too, are unearthing inscriptions that prove Yahweh once had a consort, that Israel's false gods were not illusions but erased realities. Artists reimagine divinity with black faces, breaking centuries of Eurocentric imagery. The gods are returning to the stage of history unveiled, undeniable. This unmasking terrifies institutions that depend on forgetting. For if Osiris still rises, then resurrection is not unique to Christianity. If Ma'at still weighs hearts, then justice cannot be monopolized by the church. If Isis still nurtures, then the divine feminine cannot be silenced forever. If Shango still thunders, then Yahweh is not the only Lord of the storm. The monopoly of faith cracks when the erased gods stand revealed, but the unmasking is not only spiritual, it is political. To reclaim these gods is to reclaim history itself. It is to expose the lies of empire, to show that Africa was not a continent waiting for salvation but a cradle of divinity. It is to declare that colonization did not bring God to Africa, it tried to take God away. To honor the black gods today is to resist not just religious erasure but the cultural and political structures built upon it. And as the masks fall away, humanity faces a choice. Will we cling to the narrow story empire wrote, or will we embrace the vast, complex, and black roots of divinity? Will we continue to believe that heaven was empty until Yahweh claimed it? Or will we remember that before him, the thrones of life and death were already filled, the gods are unmasked, and once seen, they cannot be unseen? The unmasking of the black gods is not confined to temples, rivers, or festivals. It is rippling outward, reshaping culture, politics, and identity on a global scale. For when a people reclaim the gods who controlled life and death, they do not only recover rituals, they recover themselves. And when that reclamation spreads, it challenges the very foundations of the world that tried to erase them. In Africa, entire communities are reconnecting with ancestral cosmologies. From Nigeria to Ghana, from Ethiopia to South Africa, younger generations are reviving rituals that were nearly lost, speaking the names of gods their grandparents were told to forget. This is more than spirituality, it is a reassertion of dignity. It is a reminder that Africa was not a land awaiting light, but a land that once carried the torch of divine wisdom for the world. In the diaspora, the consequences run even deeper. Descendants of the enslaved find in these gods not just heritage but healing. To honor Osiris is to know death does not erase you. To honor Ma'at is to believe justice is woven into the cosmos itself. To honor Isis, Oshun, or Yemaya is to affirm that motherhood, femininity, and love are sacred powers, not weaknesses. Every altar rebuilt, every drumbeat restored, every ritual reclaimed, is an act of resistance against centuries of colonization. And in the West, the awakening rattles institutions that built their authority on erasure. Scholars can no longer ignore the parallels between Egyptian myths and biblical narratives. Artists create imagery of black divinity that forces viewers to confront the whiteness of sacred art. Activists invoke ancestral gods in movements for justice, grounding political struggle in spiritual memory. The gods return not as relics, but as guides shaping the present. This remembrance also reveals the lie of universality. For centuries, Europe claimed its god was the only true god, its culture the only true civilization, its vision the only path to salvation. But the return of the black gods proves otherwise. Divinity is not European. It is African. It is global. It is diverse. And this truth threatens systems of control that depend on narrowness. The consequences are profound. Religion must face its own history of theft and suppression. Politics must reckon with the ways it used theology to justify conquest. Communities must confront the shame they inherited and replace it with pride. And individuals, everywhere, are invited to ask themselves, what gods have been erased from my story? What truths have I been taught to fear? For when the masks fall, humanity sees that heaven was never empty. It was always crowded with voices, with faces, with powers long denied. And among those voices, the black gods speak loudest now, reminding us that death is not the end, that justice is balance, that life is sacred in every form. But if the gods are remembered worldwide, then the final step remains, not only to know their names again, but to live their truths. For memory is only the beginning. Awakening is the destination. We have walked through the ruins of temples, through whispers of memory, through centuries of silence and disguise. We have seen how the gods who once ruled life and death, Osiris, Isis, Ma'at, Anubis, Shango, Oshun, Yemaya, and countless others were erased, demonized, rewritten. We have seen how Yahweh's rise was not the beginning of divinity, but the conquest of it, built on the ashes of gods far older, far darker, far more intimate with the people they served. And yet, despite erasure, the black gods endured. They survived in proverbs, in songs, in stories whispered by firelight. They hid in the rhythm of drums, in the sway of hips, in the prayers that poured out beneath the cover of saints. They lived in secret altars, in forbidden dances, in the hearts of a people who refused to forget. Now, the silence is breaking. The masks have fallen. The gods rise once more, not as relics of the past, but as living forces. They rise in festivals where rivers are filled with offerings. They rise in ceremonies where drums thunder without apology. They rise in scholars uncovering inscriptions that empire tried to bury. They rise in young people calling the names of their ancestors without shame. They rise in the truth that cannot be killed, that before Yahweh, before empire, before erasure, the black gods already held the keys to life and death. This awakening is more than history. It is healing. It restores balance where imbalance reigned. It returns dignity where shame was planted. It reclaims the sacred in the body, in the earth, in the rhythms of life that were once called sin. It is the breaking of chains forged not of iron but of fear. For when you remember that your ancestors walked with gods who looked like you remember that divinity is not foreign. It is within you. It has always been within you. The church fears this because it cannot control it. Empires tremble because they built themselves on forgetting, but the people are remembering, and with memory comes power. Power to heal, power to resist, power to live fully, without apology, without chains. And so the question that remains is not whether the black gods existed. That truth is undeniable. The question is whether you will hear their call, whether you will let their memory awaken in you, whether you will allow the gods of life and death to remind you that you, too, are sacred. You, too, are eternal. You, too, carry the divine spark. The awakening is here. The gods are rising, and with them, humanity rises too, no longer in fear, but in truth, no longer in silence, but in song, no longer erased, but remembered. The cycle of life and death has never belonged to one God alone. It has always been shared, guarded, guided by many. And now, as the forgotten gods take their place again,